In the middle of the 1150s, Aelred began to define himself as a historian. He had certainly grown up loving and reading the Venerable Bede, and he in fact quotes from him repeatedly in his historical works. The first thing that he wrote as a historian was the Battle of the Standard in 1153, but almost immediately after that, he wrote a lament for the death of King David of Scotland, who died in May 1153. He then went on in the next year, in 1154, to write the genealogy of the kings of the English, and between 1161 and 63, he wrote the life of Saint Edward, King and Confessor. That's a saint's life, but it is actually still directly concerned with English history. Of these three later works after the Battle of the Standard, the core concern is good government, how kings should behave in order to achieve peace and prosperity for their people. After 19 years of civil war in England, it's no wonder that he was concerned with this. And it seems to be, his desire for peace seems to have been a theme that ran through everything he wrote, but it certainly dominates the historical works. In Spiritual Friendship, which he wrote in the mid-1160s, he says, God determined that peace should guide all his creatures and society unite them. Thus, from him who is supremely and uniquely one, all should be allotted some trace of his unity. This statement about the importance of peace as coming directly from God's own unity, God's own desire for peace, is an idea that unites his historical works. So, David died in May of 1153, and Aelred presumably wrote his lament starting immediately after that. In the Battle of the Standard, he portrays David, if not as a villain, at least at fault. Fault for being weak-willed, for not exercising control over his forces. So he's not a villain, but he's not as good as he should have been either. The same thing, interestingly, turns up in his lament for King David. He does not try to glaze over David's faults. In fact, he calls attention to the faults and calls attention to the fact that it would be possible to make excuses, but he's not willing to do that. But he clearly loves David and admires him, and so this lament is a true lament. He calls David my gentlest lord and my friend. And throughout the lament, he talks about what Aelred has done for Scotland. It's in fact a work that blends grief on behalf of Scotland and then finally ends with Aelred's own grief. In fact, the work is as much a eulogy for Aelred as it is lament for his loss. Many of the Cistercian laments, there are 9 that we know of written in the 12th century, or in the 12th century. Most of them have a struggle between reason and affection, or between a reason and grief. In this one, the contest is not between reason and grief. It really is a way of assembling the public grief with the private grief and bringing those two together and moving back and forth. Most obviously, we can see this work as what we can call an envelope construction. It begins with public grief and ends with private grief. So, although Aelred is very much present within it, it's only at the very end that we get truly to hear his voice. We hear his lamentation, but his own sorrow for David doesn't appear till the end. For the most part, the work shows David as a good king in terms of justice and willingness to listen to his people. He, in fact, demonstrates monastic virtues. There's a real emphasis on humility and on concern for the humble, the vulnerable. And there's a constant explanation of the value of good kingship. Also, there's an emphasis on the need for Scotland to work, now that David is gone, to work with his grandsons, his heirs. At the same time, and this is not a separate issue, he shows David very much as a man of God, a man of prayer, a man devoted to the sacraments, devoted to the cross, working closely with the church and with a devotion to or an assistance to other men of God. So we see David as powerful and just and merciful, and we see David as committed to the life of faith. And both of these things are what Aelred shows as central to his character and the reason that he is weeping for him. He also recalls not only David in this work, but as he did in Battle of the Standard. And as I say, the two works seem to have been written very closely together. He recalls the goodness of Prince Henry, who died before his father, leaving his father grieving, but also leaving his father with two young grandsons as heirs. So all of this anxiety for the kingdom and grief for David and grief for his son Henry are all wrapped up in this lament. The lament begins with a crying out to the people to grieve. But it's already looking and beginning here with David's support of the church. He says, "The holy and devout King David has passed from this world, although he has found a place worthy of such a soul. His death requires a lament from me. For who would not mourn for a man so necessary to the world, now freed from human affairs, except one who resents peace and success in human affairs? Everyone must grieve for David unless you're opposed to peace, and who's opposed to peace after all? Young men and maidens, aged and young, clothe yourselves in sackcloth and scatter ashes. Let your cry be heard on high and your lament in heaven. Between the vestibule and the altar, weep, you priests of the Lord, you ministers of our God, because he who used to console you has gone from you, the one who clothed you twofold, who enriched you with gifts, who exalted you with honors." So we begin with the necessity of David to the kingdom, the necessity of David to peace in the kingdom, but also specifically with his kindness to the priests. So we have a definition here. No one's been quite sure what to call this work. Some people have called it a eulogy. Domenico Pezzini has called it the life of King David. The Cistercian Publications translation refers to it as lamentation. But you notice that here in this first paragraph, Aelred refers to it as a lament repeatedly. His death requires a lament from me. Let your cry be heard on high and your lament in heaven. So we start out with Aelred's own understanding of this, not as a life, not as a eulogy, but as a lamentation. And that tone of sorrow is what governs the work. But now he goes on to address the question of David's virtues. And as we're used to with Aelred, we have a long string of virtues, a string of characteristics, and this runs throughout. He says, his gentleness made him lovable. His justice made him fearsome. His chastity made him calm. His humility made him accessible. If we consider all of these things praiseworthy in one private life, how much the more in a king whose power gives him the right to do whatever he wills. This is the theme that we see in others of Aelred's historical works as well. The idea that, of course, that we know that kings, with all the power in the world, can do what they want. So if you find a king who is gentle, who is virtuous, who is merciful, who is just, well, that's really special. And that's the hallmark, then, of a good king, one who does not simply exert power at will, but who exerts these gentler virtues, the virtues which are actually fundamental Christian virtues, monastic virtues. Then goes on to talk about peace. Not undeservedly, then, did he, a gentle man, inherit the land, more land than any of his predecessors had possessed. And he delighted in an abundance of peace, which he brought about with great foresight among barbarous peoples. We may think, for example, of the Galwegians, that shaggy group of people who fought against their enemies with loud shouts and terror. He was actually able to unite all the peoples, and he had so much land, which may sound sort of trivial to us, but for a kingdom, to have lots of land is a good thing, because if you have lots of land, then you don't have to invade your neighbors. And this is something that Aelred would have been concerned about, because the Scots had always been looking enviously at the north of England to expand their territory. But David, he says, inherited lots of land. He was rich in land, and that means they didn't have to look elsewhere. He was, in all his humility and his mercy, he was especially good, as is right, to the widows and orphans. For while he entrusted other affairs of the kingdom to others, he always reserved the affairs of the poor and of widows to himself. He was their advocate, he their defender, their judge. No pauper, no widow or orphan bringing any complaint was ever forbidden to go into him, but was admitted at once into the guest house. Even if the king was occupied with the most important and necessary affairs and councils, even with the great or with few people, he set everything aside and listened. And now Aelred introduces himself into this, and we remember that Aelred, after all, spent 10 years of his life living at court, serving as David's steward. So, in fact, he's able to speak in his own voice as a witness, not just what he's heard from other people, but from what he knows by seeing it. I saw once with my own eyes that as he was ready to go hunting, having placed his foot in the stirrup ready to mount his horse, he drew it back at the voice of a poor man demanding that he give him a hearing. Leaving his horse, he went back into the hall. He did not return to his purpose that day, but kindly and patiently heard the case for which he had been summoned. He was accustomed, moreover, to sit at the entrance to the royal hall and attentively to hear the cases of the poor people and the old women, who were called in on certain days from the various places he had visited, and to satisfy each one of them, often with great effort. For often they argued with him, and he with them, when he was unwilling to show favoritism to poor people contrary to justice, and they were unwilling to agree to the decision he handed down. You wish you could hear more of this, because the idea of the old women coming in from the countryside, and the king says, well, Mother Jones, I hear what you're saying, but it seems to me that your neighbor is right in this case. And Mother Jones saying, I don't know how you can say that. If you knew that woman and had heard everything she'd done to me. And the king says, yes, but in this case we have to exercise justice. And she said, just a minute here. Perfectly clearly, he did not create terror in the poor people of his area. He argues with them over their claims. I think this is a wonderful episode, and we just have to wish that Aelred had given us more content of it. But on top of these virtues that show just how good he was as a man of justice and of mercy, he's also someone who serves God, and this is really a central theme of this work. Not undeservedly, then, was he seen to be beloved by God and humans. He was obviously beloved by God, having at the very beginning of his reign Aelred has been learning something about structure. He begins with David's goodness to the church, and now he's coming back to it and pointing it as the beginning of David's reign. He at once diligently carried out the things that are God's, building churches and founding monasteries, which he also enhanced with possessions and loaded with honors. For having found in all the kingdom of the Scots only 3 or 4 bishops, with the other churches without a shepherd, wavering, at risk their morals and possessions, at his death he left 9 churches, not only ancient ones that he had restored, but also new ones that he had erected. He also founded monasteries, neither few nor small. And above all, he was solicitous that the priests of the Lord and men in religious life should especially keep from public disagreements, as well as from internal and domestic ones. As often as discord did arise among them, such is human wretchedness, his spirit would not rest nor his body sleep until he had recalled them to their former peace by his prayers, tears, and sometimes blandishments, but rarely threats. This is an interesting little detail. Aelred clearly knows quite a lot about arguments among men of religion. And this is not the only work in which he raises the issue of conflict within the church and what a bad thing it is, and about suggesting that the king may himself have something to do with that it's not a matter that should be left to the church, but is something that has to do with royal power and royal concern for peace. Now, Aelred is writing at the time of Gregorian reform, when there's a lot of question about who has authority over priests. And it seems to me that Aelred is suggesting a slightly old-fashioned view that says that if there's conflict within the church, it's not just the bishop who should deal with it, but the king needs to get into it because it has to do, among other things, with the peace of the realm. And so he makes it clear that David not only deals with the old people and with the widows and so on, but that he also is paying attention to what's going on in the church and is interceding when necessary. And that he attempts to deal with problems by prayers, tears, and blandishments, but tries as much as he can not to threaten. But he doesn't say he never threatens, rarely threats. So we get to hear something about the line that David has to tread to try to keep things in order without being overbearing in his power. But David, in fact, despite all his virtues, all the wonderful things we can say about him on behalf of the kingdom, he was not entirely good. Aelred goes on, I admit that our David too sinned. He sinned not by himself committing some foul crime, but by taking advantage of the violence of cruelty of others beyond what was appropriate. I think of prayers to God to forgive what we have done, but also what has been done on our behalf by others. Even if we didn't have any control of it, how much do we bear responsibility for what other people have done in our name? This is part of what Aelred's talking about. He took advantage of the cruelty of others beyond what was appropriate. Some of us might have wanted to stop after others, suggest that there is some appropriateness involved in the cruelty of others, but Aelred includes it. And now he tells us what exactly he's talking about. After the death of King Henry, and this is King Henry I, King Henry II is not yet on the throne. After the death of King Henry, when King David led his army into England, that race, savage and exceedingly hostile to the English, carried out cruel judgments, raging beyond human custom against the church, against priests, against both sexes and every age. All this was done even though he did not will it. Indeed, deeds may even have been forbidden. Yet, And it's those little words that are so important, right? Yet. He could have refused to lead the army. He could, after one experience, have refused to lead them a second time. He could perhaps have restrained them more. With tears I confess that he sinned. Now he tells us that there is an argument to be made for David. Others may excuse him, alleging his zeal for justice. That's good. Justice is a good thing. Calling attention to the oath he had made, that is, the oath he had made to support his niece, Matilda, the Empress Matilda, for the crown of England. Claiming that this matter, and listen to the series here, claiming that this matter pertained to royal virtue, that he kept his trust, that he did not violate his oath, that he bore arms against perjurers, that he tried to reclaim for heirs the kingdom that their father had given them, and that the clergy and people had confirmed by sworn testimony. This is a whole string of reasons that you could excuse David. Perhaps these few words of excuse, he says, have some place in the presence of your loving kindness, Lord Jesus. I, however, knowing that it is good to confess to you, have chosen to ask, not to excuse, seeking mercy, not presuming judgment. And so what was the result of David's sin? Well, God exercised vengeance against him. At length, O God of vengeance, he says, so that his patience, that is, David's patience, should become known to everyone, you poured out your wrath upon him, the full wrath of your fury. You chastened him with a cruel chastisement when you took his only son from him. And what a son! This is Prince Henry, Aelred's boyhood friend. He was truly a splendid youth, loved by everyone. That I may briefly recall all his virtues, he was in every way like his father, except for being a little sweeter-tempered. O Lord my God, with what scourges of sorrow you afflicted his heart, David's heart, when he carried to the grave his only son, whom he had known by experience to be most loving, like himself. The son from whom he had hoped to receive that service, that is, that his son should carry him to the grave. But while others were weeping and wailing, that man did not fail in fortitude. He received the father's rod with such patience that he restrained his tears and took food with his family in the royal manner on the very day of his death. We remember the biblical King David, who, after his son is dead, after he has prayed for his life and the son has died, he washes his face and returns to his life. And here we have King David of Scotland behaving in the same way, eating dinner with his family. And then we move forward to David's preparation for his death, which actually fills a large portion of this work. And Aelred once again is present as a witness. But notice all these passages about him witnessing are not really about him. They are about him bearing testimony. At last, in the sacred days of Lent, when for some urgent need of our house I was in his presence, I confess I found in the king a monk, a cloister in the court, in the palace the discipline of a monastery. For at certain times he gave himself to the divine offices and was intent on the psalms and prayers, and he set a certain time aside for service to the poor. When at the time of lamplighting had come, he sought his chaste cell in perfect silence, not speaking to anyone from then until the rising of the sun. O happy soul, whom the Lord found thus watching when he came, so prepared he went in with him to the marriage feast. But in fact, David hasn't died yet, and Aelred now interrupts the narrative of David's progress toward death by returning to the theme of lament and the theme of what's Scotland going to do. And he says, "What will you do, O desolate Scotland? Who will console you? Who will take pity on you? And now we get, again, the praise of David. He is gone, he who made you illustrious, he who made you an uncultivated and sterile land, beautiful and fruitful. Formerly, a beggar in other lands, having to import food for your people, you inflicted famine on your inhabitants by your hard ground. Now that it is softer and more fruitful than that of others, you alleviate scarcity in neighboring regions from your abundance. I do not believe that somehow David softened the land of Scotland. I don't quite understand that, but he is saying it used to be you had to get your food from elsewhere, and now you're able to feed surrounding neighbors. Whether that's true, I don't have a clue. He adorned you with castles and others. He lifted up high towers. He enriched your ports with foreign merchandise and increased your delights with the delicacies of other kingdoms. He exchanged your shaggy clothes for precious garments and covered your former nakedness with linen and purple. He set your barbarous way of life aright by the Christian religion. We keep coming back to the church and everything about David. He persuaded you by his word and example alike to go often to church and to be present at the divine sacrifice. And he ordered that the priests be paid the offerings and tithes due to them. This is a good king. If he makes sure that the priests get paid, this is one measure of his goodness as a king. And therefore, what's the result? He says to Scotland, what then will you give him for all that he has given you? You assuredly have some persons in whom to repay him. You certainly have some in whom to give thanks in his stead, some to whom you can repay the good things he deserved. You have him in his grandsons from whom divine providence has taken their grandfather's help so quickly, perhaps for no other reason than that your faith may be tested and your thankfulness tried. Pay to the sons what you owe the father. May they find you grateful for the favors you received. Above all, may the peril of the English, because the war is still going on, may the peril of the English teach you to trust in kings and to preserve mutual concord among yourselves, lest strangers devour your country before your eyes and it be forsaken as a hostile wasteland. Again, peace. A good king makes the land rich, brings peace to the country, makes the people church-going, supports the priest, takes care of the humble, and in return, the people must be able to continue what he has set up. I wish, if I had been organizing this lament, I think I would have arranged it so that it would go specifically moving from what he has done to what is expected. But Aelred doesn't organize it that way, having interrupted the story of David's death to give us the appeal to the people of Scotland. He now returns to the narrative of the death. So, as death approaches, when David's illness became more serious and the severity of his feebleness deprived him of the ability either to stand or to walk, he summoned clerics and religious and asked that the sacrament of the Lord's body be given to him. As they were preparing to bring what he had ordered, he forbade them, saying that he would receive the sacred mysteries at the sacred altar. He was therefore carried to the oratory on the hands of clerics and soldiers. This is a pretty powerful image. He who has supported the church all this time, but who has done all the royal things for the kingdom, is carried to the altar by clerics and by soldiers. The expansiveness of what he has done for the people of Scotland, all the people of Scotland, is conveyed in his going to the altar to receive the Eucharist, supported by these representatives of his people. He goes forward, closer to death, and as death is approaching, he asks to receive the cross, the black cross, which was a family heirloom. that he might worship it. And he says to someone who carries out such tasks for him, have you given the alms today? You know, you're supposed to give alms every day. I hope you haven't been distracted by my death, but have given alms to the poor. Yes, yes, he says, I gave the alms today. Don't worry about that. As the Sunday that preceded the ascension of Christ dawned, he crossed over into the joys of the true light with such tranquility that he seemed not to have died, but to have fallen asleep, with such devotion that he was found to have raised both his hands clasped above his breast toward heaven. And Aelred cries out, assist him, saints of God. Come to meet him, angels of the Lord. Receive a soul worthy of your company. May that mother of mercy be with him, she who is as much more powerful than others as her loving kindness is more efficacious. And so Aelred comes to the end of his lament. And he ends it now, not with the appeal to Scotland, and not for more praise for the public man, but he ends with his own memories of the private man, the man who was his friend, and what he did for him when he knew him. It's worth in this last passage, which ends the lament, to remember that the story of Aelred's conversion is that he went on some unknown trip to England and got distracted by hearing about the monastery and decided all of a sudden to become a monk rather than returning to Scotland. This passage, I think, casts a new light on that. So Aelred ends the work. I too, though a sinner and unworthy, nevertheless remember, addressing David, remember your kindnesses, my most gentle Lord and friend, which you showered on me from an early age. I remember the grace in which you now for the last time received me. I remember the goodwill with which you granted all my requests. I remember the generosity that you showed me. I remember the embraces and kisses with which you released me, not without tears, while all those present marveled. I skim over my tears for you. I relinquish my attachment and I pour out all my spirit. For you, I offer this sacrifice to my God. I expend this effort because of your kindnesses. And because this is so slight, my mind will always remember you in the very core of its being, there where, for the salvation of all, the Son of the Father is daily sacrificed. So Aelred writes a lament which is full of acknowledgement of David's goodness, his virtue, his kindness to his people, his faith, his devotion, and also acknowledges his sin, his wrongdoing, and claims that his suffering is because of God exercising vengeance. And yet ends not with David the public man for good or for bad, and not with continuing to reserve anger at David, blame for David, but instead ends, as we all do when we grieve for those we love, not by thinking any more about what they did wrong, but about their tenderness to us, the relationship we had with them. And remembering Aelred's concern with memory and with finding God in the memory, he ends, my mind will always remember you. When I think of you, I will find you there. My mind will always remember you in the very core of its being, there, in the core of its being, there where, for the salvation of all, the Son of the Father is daily sacrificed.